Hey everyone, this is the second set of notes for memory. Get started. So the first thing when we one of the first things we got to talk about is when we retrieve memories. Um, there's something called the serial position effect, which kind of shows how easy it is to remember something in regards to lists or groups of things. Um, And sometimes you'll see this called the serial position effect as a whole, which basically just says that we tend to remember things from a list. We tend to remember the beginning and the end much easier than what's in the middle. Um, and then sometimes you'll see it referred to specifically as the primacy and the recency effect. Primacy being the beginning of the list and recency being the end of the list. And the example I always use for this, and if we were in class, this is I would ask everyone if they, how many of the presidents they could name in order, or just how many presidents they know in general in our country's history. And usually it's the first couple ones: Washington, Adams, Jefferson, maybe some get to Madison and Monroe, maybe. And then they can usually remember the more recent ones, obviously, with the current president, President Trump, and then Obama and uh, George W. Bush. And, you know, maybe you remember Clinton, maybe you remember George H.W. Bush. I don't know. But what that means is that, you tend to remember the beginning of the list and the end of the list much easier than the ones in the middle. If I was to ask you who the, 21st president was, okay, you probably wouldn't know. Okay. And the only way I would be able to know is if I did that song I was talking about in the first things all the way up to number 21, which I will spare you for, and not do that. But, you don't remember the ones in the middle as easy as you do at the beginning and the end. That's what the primacy and recency effect are. Or if you just refer to the whole thing as um, the serial position effect. Okay. Another example, just real quick, is on the, usually on the first day of school, or first day of the semester during school, I tend to remember names of kids I've never had before. I tend to remember those in first period or whatever my first class of the day is, and the ones at the end of the day. Usually that second period, whatever it is, you know, it tends to be the one that I don't remember as many names. And it's the same thing as it's saying the ones in the middle, we tend to not remember the as well as the ones at the beginning and the end of the list. All right. So when we retrieve memories, we tend to either do it through recall and recognition retrieval. Recall is when you use, just a general cue, and you have to kind of fill in with your memory. The example here, if I give you a free, like on the AP exam, when they give you a free response, they're going to give you a prompt. They're going to probably give you some terms and stuff to use in that prompt, but the rest of it's up to you. So you're going to have to recall what you know about those terms and that prompt, and entirely from memory. There's no help that's going to be given to you. That's recall. And then recognition memory is when you use a specific cue to retrieve a memory. So this would be like multiple choice. Like, that you're looking for whatever the question's asking for, but then you only have to recognize it from a list of possible answers. One of those answers is correct. So you just have to recognize which one is the best answer. You can't do that with recall memory. Recall memory is, it's a general cue that you have to kind of use all of your knowledge to help you figure out. But with recognition, you just have to recognize which one is the correct answer. Sometimes I'm really, I think I've mentioned this in class before, I'm really good with faces. I will recognize, like if I've seen you somewhere, I can generally place, okay, I know that person from somewhere. And it'll happen all the time when me and my wife are like out in public and I may see someone I recognize. But because I don't have a specific thing to compare that memory to, I'm just kind of like, oh, look, the person looks familiar. And then if she says, oh, well, yeah, they go to church with us, or oh yeah, I used to work in in their office or something, or oh, I'm pretty sure you used to teach with that person or whatever. Like, then that's when the recognition would kick in. I'd be like, oh, okay. And I can usually use a specific cue to help me figure out that person's name. So recall would just be like, I kind of know who that is. And then the recognition is like, oh, they're from this office or this part of my life or whatever. Recognition happens much quicker than recall. Recall memory is usually not as accurate as recognition memory. Okay. All right. So the next way we can retrieve memories is from something called context dependent memory. And this is when what this says is that we tend to recall memories easier if we are put in the same context in which those memories were made, which sounds a little weird. But basically what this means is that if you put yourself into the same context that your environment was, the people you were around, whatever, as when the memory was made, it is usually easier to recall that memory. I had a friend in college, again, real quick story. I had a friend in college who, at the beginning of the semester, you always get your syllabus and it tells you, literally on the first day of class, when your final exam is and the time of day and the room it's going to be in and all that. And as it got closer to final exams and as we started studying for final exams, I had a friend who would go to the room in which our exam was going to be in, because sometimes it wasn't always in the same room as where the class was. He would go to the room in which the final exam was going to be taking place in, and he would study for an hour maybe, or 30 minutes to an hour each night in that room, because what he found was that as he was taking the exam, he's in the same area in which the memory was made, and it made it easier to remember than sitting in the library or his dorm room or whatever. Now, I never tried it. I didn't know about this when I was in college, so I can't say whether this is true or not, but it's true enough to be talked about in a psychology class, so there must be some element to it. One way you can also think about this is song lyrics. I know that sounds kind of weird, but like, if someone were to ask you what are the lyrics to this song, you may be able to just talk about it normally and be like, you just spout it off from memory, whatever. What you're probably going to do is you're probably going to start humming the song or playing it in your head or whatever, and then saying it to it like it's sung, say the lyrics back to them like it's sung, because that's how you remember it in the first place. The context is the music, not the words themselves. So the words themselves are easier to say if you put your mind in the same context in which the memory was made. This can also be, like I said, environment. This can be people. There are a couple of others we're going to talk about in a minute that are more like mood and emotion and things like that. But context is more environment or the process in which the memory was made. On the flip side of that, you have the state dependent memory, which this is more like state of mind or mental state. This is more emotion. These two right here, state dependent and mood congruent, they're easily confused because emotion and mood sometimes can get confused with one another. Excuse me. But state dependent can either be emotional state, like whether you were tired or whether you were under the influence or something, then that means that if you return to that same state of mind, tired, under the influence, you may pick up on memories easier that were made when you were in that same state of mind. Okay. So that's state dependent. Mood congruent is, what this means is that whatever mood you are currently in, you tend to recall memories easier that were consistent with that current mood. For example, if you've ever been dumped, look at me. But if you've ever been dumped or broken up with or whatever, and you're in kind of a sad state of mind, suddenly what can happen is sometimes you can just have a snowball effect of like all the sad memories you've ever seemed to have just seem to snowball on top of one another. Or if you're angry at somebody, suddenly everything that's ever made you mad about that person starts snowballing. That's mood congruent. The memory becomes almost a bias, and it reinforces the mood that you're in. So you become sadder, you become angrier. And it can be positive. It can be, I think, you know, if you've ever like, I'll give you an example. I caught up with a couple of my college buddies a couple of years ago. We all met up one weekend at UNC. You wearing a UNC shirt? We met up at UNC for a football game one weekend, and we hung out before the game, went to the game, after the game, and getting around those guys for the first time in years since we had been in college together. And most of us are married now. Some of us have kids, and but we were still constantly having memories of, oh, do you remember that time this happened? And like, none of us had probably ever thought about it that much until we get around the people in which, you're almost in a nostalgic mood, like you're reminiscing with those people in which the memories were made with. So therefore, they're remembered a little bit easier. That's more mood congruent memory. Again, state dependent is external state, external context, emotion. Mood is like mood that you are in right now, makes it easier to remember a similar mood memory, and then it reinforces the mood that you're in. So this is one of those things that kind of just gets thrown in this set of notes. It's sometimes you'll see it called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, or Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve, or whatever, the Ebbinghaus curve. Basically what this says is that he did a bunch of research on how quickly or how much we remember over time. And what he found was that a lot of memories or a lot of the stuff we learn or experience, or, and I talked a little bit about this in the first set of notes. A lot of what we remember, or a lot of what we learned, we tend to forget pretty quickly. And you can see on this chart here, I won't draw on the screen or anything, but if you see on this chart over here, you can see that even 20 minutes, we've forgotten almost according to Ebbinghaus, we've forgotten over 40% of the information we just learned. And but what this also shows is that, as time goes on, it tends to level off much more. And you can see that, there's a sharp drop off very quickly. But then, almost a month later, it's only about a 30% difference. So what it showed was that not only do we forget, or not only can we forget a lot right off the bat, we also tends to kind of level out over time. And, it doesn't drop off the same rate over time. Okay, interference. This is something that shows up pretty regularly on the AP exam. And it's very easily confused, proactive and retroactive. What this theory says is that we can have memories that are very, very similar, and they almost compete with one another in our mind, and it can either cause us to forget old information that is very similar, or it can interfere with new information. An old memory can interfere with new information because they're so similar. So I'll explain that more in just a minute. So there are two types. There's proactive and retroactive. Proactive interference is when old information jumps forward and interferes with recalling new information. The example I put on here is like if you've ever had to change your password for something, which as an example, like Wake County requires us to reset our passwords every so often for our email and Wake ID and all that stuff. So usually what happens is whenever I change that password, the first couple of times I go to type it in, I tend to type in the old one before I memorize the new one. It takes me a while because that old information has covered up the new information of recall. Another example that kids tend to say with this over the years is whenever we come back from the winter break and it's New Year has changed over, the first couple of days they write the wrong year. They write, like this past year, they'd still be writing 2019 instead of 2020. So that's just one example. It's proactive. The information goes old, it jumps up and interferes with new. Maybe a more funny example of this would be like if you called your new girlfriend by your old girlfriend's name. Guys, don't do that. Never a good decision. So there's that. And then retroactive is when the new information that you have learned causes you to forget the old information that was similar in the past. Now, an example of this, and this used to, I think, be more relevant than it is now because everybody kind of keeps throwing the same phone number forever now. But if you were to get a new phone number or a new phone, it might take you a while to really to memorize that new number. But then a couple years down the line, if someone says, "Oh, what was your old phone number again?" You may have forgotten it. Maybe not. I don't know. But if you, I'll give you an example. Like when I was filling out job applications right out of college, they asked for all the previous addresses we had lived at for the last 5 years. And that's normally not that big of a deal because most people live at places for a while. But, when you're in college, you tend to move around a lot. Every year is a different address. And I had to go back and right out of college, I was going back and I couldn't remember the last 3 or 4 addresses. I had to go back and look and see what they were because that new information of where I was currently was covering up the old information of where I had been, the similar information, which was addresses. So the way I remember this, and this is just a quick kind of trick I help remember, proactive, if you're being proactive about something, you're trying to get out in front of it. And so proactive would be going forward, getting in front, and covering up old information. That's proactive. Retroactive, if retro means going backwards, that would be old information going back and covering up new information. And that you can't recall now. So anyway, those are the two types of interference. So when we forget, there's usually, a couple of ways there's a lot of different ways that we can have encoding failure. In other words, encoding failure, is a way that we forget information. What that means is that we don't put enough effort or we don't do the correct way of encoding information from short-term to long-term. Divided attention is a very common one. What I mean by that, and I usually try to call people out in class when I do this, is if you're texting on your phone the entire time I'm talking, you're not going to remember what I'm saying. You're not, or if you're texting constantly while you're also trying to write down notes, or if you're texting while you're trying to read, you're not going to retain any of that because it's not going to move from short-term to long-term successfully because your attention is divided. And that's an encoding failure. It's not going to get where it needs to go from short-term to long-term if there's interference between it. Okay. So that encoding failure is one way to forget. That retrieval failure is when it's in long-term memory, but something's preventing you from getting it to short-term and being able to remember it easier. Interference, like we just talked about, retroactive and proactive. Faulty cues, something you think that something you should remember something in one way, but you're not. That's another. That's a cue. So in other words, the cue you think you should be taking to remember a memory isn't the right one. That's a faulty cue. And then also emotional states, like if you're angry or mad or sad or whatever, then sometimes your emotional state can keep you from remembering things as easier. Like if you're angry, you're not going to be thinking properly about what you need to recall. Sometimes this results in things like if you ever heard of something being on the tip of your tongue, like, you know that person, but you just don't know from where. It's on the tip of your tongue. You know that person's name. It's like right there, but you don't know it 100%. That we've all had it happen. That's what they sometimes call tip of the tongue phenomenon. Excuse me. Retrograde and anterograde amnesia are ways that, or are actual diagnosable conditions. Retrograde is when it's kind of the stereotypical amnesia that you hear about, where you can't recall memories from your past as easy, or something caused you to not be able to recall episodic memories from the past. Usually trauma or head injuries can cause these. Um, that would be retrograde, again, going back, not being able to remember previous memories. Anterograde amnesia is when you can't make new memories moving forward. The most well-known example of this is a guy named Henry Molaison. We didn't know his name until 2008 when he passed away because of legal concerns with because he was being researched his entire life. He was just called HM until then. Henry, he was a young man who went in he has a severe epileptic problem. He went in to get the corpus callosum cut, which we talked about back in the brain unit. But unfortunately, when he went in for this surgery, something happened with his surgery, and he his hippocampus ended up getting damaged. And remember, the hippocampus is what helps you make new memories. So he was unable to make new memories for the remainder of his life. And this happened in the late, I think, 50s or 60s. So he went almost 5 decades with not being able to make new memories. So he would wake up every day and realize that something was wrong. It was a crazy case, but that's anterograde amnesia. It's not being able to make memories and move forward. This is pretty rare, but if there's severe enough head trauma or if the hippocampus becomes damaged in any way, then you may have anterograde amnesia moving forward. Okay, this is one of the more interesting things we talk about. So this is something called the misinformation effect. This is what causes us to remember things falsely. So this is when your memories, it's not like you're trying to remember them falsely, but something can cause you to remember things different from how they actually occurred. So Elizabeth Loftus, she's actually a psychologist and a lawyer. She's a professor of psychology and law at, I think, Stanford, but don't quote me on that. She did a study she did a bunch of different scenarios like this where she would stage a car crash safely, of course, but there'd be like a group of people. There would be a staged car crash happening in front of them, and then they would split the people into 2 groups, and one person would ask them, the people who saw it, how fast do you think the car was going when they hit each other? And then the other group was asked, how fast do you think the cars were going when they smashed into each other? And what they found was that the difference in the term hit versus smashed made individuals recall memories falsely. The group that was asked how fast do you think they were going when they smashed always answered higher than the group that said how fast do you think they were going when they hit one another. Because just that use of the word smash versus hit, smash is a little more aggressive, that made them actually have a false memory. All of them answered, oh yeah, it was going this fast, and it was always higher than, or maybe not always, but the vast majority of the time it was higher than the group who was asked how fast do you think they were going when they hit one another. Just that one term. And that's what we call the misinformation effect. And that's why, and Elizabeth Loftus has written a ton of stuff on how post crime interviews and questioning and things like that should be done, because the way in which questions are asked, like right here, can cause people to remember things differently than what actually occurred. And she has written a ton of books and has done a lot of research on this. And she's very well respected in the psychology and the legal community because of all her work she's done about how memory can be affected through questioning and stuff like that. Okay, a couple of other things with memory distortion. Imagination inflation. I know it sounds like a carnival ride, but all that means is that, sometimes when we tell stories, I don't really know how true this is, but like it would say that if someone adds in a detail that maybe doesn't happen, then the next person adds in a detail, and it gets more and more, and suddenly we remember it way different than it actually happened. That's one. Source amnesia is what this means is that you have a memory. You don't necessarily remember where that memory came from, Um, you don't know if someone told you that story or if maybe you saw it on a TV show or whatever. So because you don't remember it exactly where it came from, you tend to attribute it to your own experience. So you read it or you saw it or you heard it, even though it may have been something that was just like something from a completely different source. But because you don't know exactly where that source, what that source was, you tend to attribute it to yourself. And then the last one, which we've all kind of had, is deja vu. And this is a really creepy feeling, if you know what I'm talking about, like where it feels like you've been in a room before, you've been in a situation before, that you've had this conversation before or whatever. And, deja vu is just French for already seen. But it feels like you've been in that situation before or whatever. Usually it can be explained by a similar memory, but it can't always be explained. Sometimes there's no explanation to why we feel like a sense of deja vu, but usually it can be explained that you have a very similar memory in your subconscious, or your long-term memory that maybe is beneath your subconscious or in your subconscious. And because it is so similar to what's happening in front of you, it kind of breaks through that filter of the subconscious, according to Freud, and makes its way to our awareness. But deja vu is really interesting. It's really kind of creepy at times, but it doesn't mean, that there's a glitch in the matrix or anything like that. So anyway, all right. So improving memory, these are the last couple things, and hopefully this one is a little less long than the first one. I went a little long on the first set of notes, so hopefully this one's a little shorter. Ways that you can improve your short-term memory is the easiest way is chunking. And I know that sounds kind of gross, but like chunking is when you take information and chunk it into a single unit. Again, usually 5 things or less. So this image off to the right, which my face is kind of covering up the end of it here. So if I was to give you that list of 16 letters right there, and told you just to memorize it, if you try to remember each individual letter one by one, you're probably going to have a harder time than if you chunk it together into mnemonics. So obviously, if I gave you all, now I'd probably scramble them up if I was being honest, but if I gave you all 16 or not 16, sorry, 12, can't count. If I gave you all 12 of those letters and said, hey, remember these, if you chunk them, it's going to be more difficult to remember all 12 individually than chunking it into 4 groups of 3, like FBI, TWA, CIA, IBM. Like obviously, those are easier to remember, those acronyms, than just trying to remember each letter one by one. And that improves our capacity for short-term memory, and it makes it to where we can remember more than the whole 7 plus or minus 2 thing that we talked about in the last set of notes. Maintenance rehearsal. I talked a little bit about this when I went over the Atkinson-Shiffrin model last video, but this is just repeating information to keep it in short-term memory. So saying something over and over and over again, that's maintenance rehearsal. So again, I think the example I used, which doesn't happen much anymore, but if someone verbally tells you their phone number, if you don't have anything to write it down or type it into your phone or whatever, you would just say it over and over again until you had a chance to write it down and keep it in your short-term memory. Okay. Elaborative rehearsal. This is when you tend to take new information and you relate it to something you already have in your long-term memory. So keeping information that is similar to what is already in your long-term is elaborative rehearsal. In other words, rather than just repeating it, you're finding a connection. You're finding a relationship to something you already have in your previous memory, or previous long-term memories, to keep it there. And therefore, you're not going to forget it as easily if it's just some random bit of information. Okay, and then a couple of other things. Mnemonics. I think I mentioned that I think I said last video that I know all 45 presidents in order, and the only reason I know that is because I had to learn a song when I was in elementary or middle school. I can't really remember. Imagine that. That just taught me the presidents in like this little kind of song that it made it easy to remember because it had a little beat to it and whatever. Um, I just had this literally just kind of popped in my head. I had a chemistry teacher in high school who, when we were going over ions, which I don't remember what ions were, but I remember she literally wrote a song about it and brought her guitar in and sang it to us and all that, and gave us a copy of the lyrics and all this, and she would continually play it. And we used to make so much fun of her. But I remember the day of the test, everybody in that room was humming that song under their breath to help them remember stuff on the. So that's mnemonics. It can be a song, it can be a rhyme, it can be an acronym, or actually acronyms are a little bit later, but it can be anything like that. The method of loci. This is I've never tried this, but apparently this is good for people who give like speeches and don't want to have to constantly look down at their cards or whatever. And what this means is they would almost like create a like a road map, and they put things at each stop in this map, and they would literally just walk through the map in their mind, and then they'd keep everything. So if I'm giving a speech about the AP exam, I want to make sure that I go over all these points. And I made a road map out of my house, and I started in the kitchen, and then I went to the living room and the bedroom and all that. Like I would put what I want to talk about in each room, and therefore, okay, I'm going to go from the kitchen to here, from the kitchen to the living room to the bedroom to the bathroom, whatever. And at each point on that map, there's different bits of information that I would have to talk about. That's the method of loci. Like first you memorize the layout, then you place information at stops along the way, and then you walk through it, and it helps you remember it easier. And then the last thing, we've all done this, acronyms. Roy G. Biv is the most common to help us remember the color spectrum. It can be anything. We PEMDAS. I think people always say PEMDAS for the order of operations in math, like things like that. It's anything that helps you remember an order, a list or whatever of information, and it helps you. It's like a code word to help you remember the first letter of the items you need to remember. So, again, Roy G. Biv, PEMDAS, whatever. So that's an acronym. And this is more long-term memory. You figure it out once and you remember it once, it's going to stick with you for a while. Same thing with these mnemonics and the method of loci were both for long-term as well. Once you remember, like the song, I don't remember the chemistry song I was talking about, but I remember the president's song, and that's stuck with me since then, and I just keep adding presidents to it. I remember, I'm probably going to remember it for much longer than I remember it right now. So that's more long-term memory. And I think that's the last one. All right. Yep. That's it. So that's it for memory, which is the first content topic of this week. So that's it for this first set of information. And the next one will be on thinking in language, or cognition in language. And that'll be the second half of this week. But I'll see you then. You guys take care. Hope you're doing well. And I'll see you soon.